Good afternoon. I'm Melanie White, President of the Women's Club. Happy New Year, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome members in the auditorium, as well as our members viewing online. A very special welcome to our potential member guests here today. I understand we have 9 guests, 3 of whom have active applications, and we have 1 brand new member and 8 current members hosting these guests. Let's thank these ladies that are joining us today. I do hope that if you're a guest today taking a look at us, that you become a member of the Women's Club. You fill out your application and become a member right away because you belong here. And we have so many interesting programs planned you just will not want to miss. Following today's program, please join us in the Halsey Hall to meet our speaker, Liza Mundy. Now, it's a new year. Please take out your phone. We can have a clean record starting off today. You know what to do with them. There are so many wonderful opportunities coming up to connect with the Women's Club. We have Let's Talk Politics with Jim Bacon and Bob Lewis on January 21st at 11:45. There are a few spots left, but please note this is a members-only event. The registration deadline for this is January 14th. We have a dinner and book discussion about Ina Garten. This is on March 25th at 5:30 in the evening, and the registration deadline is March 20th. We have a day trip to the Ann Spencer House and Garden Museum and Poplar Forest on April 2nd, 2026. The registration deadline is March 2nd. You may sign up for this on the members portal, or we have a reception table we have a table in our reception that you may sign up for this and other special events. On a more solemn note, in late December, we unexpectedly lost 2 colleagues and friends who were passionate champions of our wonderful city, its past, present, and future. Eddie Slipek died on December 15th following a brief illness. Bill Martin passed away on December 28th from injuries sustained after being struck by a car while crossing Broad Street. The work of these 2 great men over decades helped us understand how our city was developed and why it is the way it is. They encouraged us to look way beyond the familiar narrative of Richmond's history to learn about all the people who have called Richmond home since the early 18th century and to appreciate their contributions. They also helped us to see that an honest and inclusive appraisal of our past is the best foundation for our community's future success. If you have not already read their tribute on the January 2nd e-update, please do so. The Valentine will be holding an open house on Saturday, February 7th for those who wish to remember Bill Martin. I encourage you to attend. Thank you to the Scholarship Committee for providing our refreshments today. Thank you to Karen Berson for serving as chair of the day. Karen will now introduce Liza Mundy. Silence yourself, folks.
Good afternoon. It is my honor to introduce Liza Mundy, an award-winning journalist and the New York Times best-selling author of 4 books, including Code Girls. Her writing has appeared in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, Politico, and Smithsonian, and she has shared her expertise on The Today Show, Good Morning America, CNN, MSNBC, Fresh Air with Terry Gross, and the Women's Club in 2020, when we had the privilege of hearing her stories about the female codebreakers of World War II. The women in World War II were intelligent, creative, hardworking, and their work was vital to winning the war. They were skilled at keeping secrets, and history was equally good about keeping these extraordinary women hidden, while others were remembered and even celebrated. The Sisterhood, The Secret History of Women in the CIA, is a natural follow-up to Code Girls. Liza once again has used her extensive and meticulous research to share the overlooked efforts and accomplishments of the women in the CIA. In this book, you not only learn about the many women and the fascinating details of their work and the adversity they faced, but Liza expertly weaves in how they created an organic network to mentor and protect their female colleagues and new recruits. Liza's stories demonstrate that the CIA did not intend to create a powerful women's network by segregating and under-promoting them, but it accidentally did. These women became a secret weapon for our government, and their contributions were not despite of their gender, but because of it. I want to share a few chapter titles. They are quietly clever, but also very telling. They reveal how constrained these women were, even as they were shaping history. Get the food, Mary. You had to wear a skirt. Housewife cover, Miss Marple of Russia House, and my favorite, laundry on the line. Thanks to Liza's warm and engaging storytelling, these important moments in history are getting the recognition they deserve. Please join me in welcoming Liza Mundy.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. One of the many tidbits I learned when I was reporting this book is the CIA actually has a gadget called a shark fin that when the agent is in the room, they can suck up all the cell phone numbers of everybody in the room. And so on the topic of turning off your cell phones, I can neither confirm nor deny whether I have one of those with me. But anyway, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and it's wonderful to be here in Virginia. Coming to Richmond is truly coming home for me, literally coming home for me. I was born in Newport News. I'm a native Virginian, raised in Roanoke, and my mom lives here in Richmond, and many of my family members and friends and neighbors are here as well. So it's really thrilling to speak here. And also the origins of the club as a place that was created by women, often women who had been denied a college education, as they were back in the day, and yet were determined to acquire education and self-improvement and stay abreast of current events and read books together. And the fact that the club makes books and book clubs available to its memberships is incredibly meaningful to me. And I'm so grateful to be here for that reason and so many other reasons. It's wonderful to be in the fellowship with people who value learning and value books. And I realize that there's nothing more exciting and stimulating, particularly after lunch, than a good PowerPoint presentation. But I love sharing photos that I came upon when I was researching the Sisterhood. Some of them are photos that had never seen the light of day. They were shared with me by the covert operatives who had incredibly exciting lives, and I do love sharing them. Now, I think that because the book is called The Sisterhood, and because this is the women's club, you might think that the presentation is going to be mostly about women, but because of the controversial nature of DEI these days, I thought it might be safer to start with these guys, or shall I say this guy. So I think it's fair to say for many of us, male and female, when you think of a secret agent, when you think of a spy, popular culture has really inculcated us with one person in particular. He's a white guy of a certain age with sort of brown hair, good looking, invariably wears a tuxedo because, as we know, spies always wear tuxedos. He has either a drink in his hand or a gun in his hand or both. He's often in the company of a beautiful woman. He spends a lot of time on ski slopes, a lot of time in casinos, a lot of time on the top of a train in, hand-to-hand combat with a villain and ducks right as they're about to go through the tunnel. So that is, I think it's fair to say, in our mind, the epitome really of the secret agent or the spy is, of course, James Bond. And if we do think about women in spycraft or in intelligence work, we think of the reliable character of Miss Moneypenny, right? She's been around for generations now. This is the original Miss Moneypenny, and this is her more current incarnation. The British actress Naomi Harris in Skyfall plays a character, and so the traditional Moneypenny is this genial, incredibly well-organized woman who sits behind a desk. She sort of keeps him straight, right? She keeps him in line. She lets him know his assignments, where he's supposed to be and when. She's the conduit between James and headquarters. Of course, she has a crush on him. She's flirtatious. She sits in his lap, but she knows of and tolerates his liaisons with other women, of which there are, of course, many. And even in this modern incarnation, I don't know, those of you who've seen Skyfall, the character that Naomi Harris plays starts out as a field agent, like James. She's out there, but at the end of the movie, and I don't think this is too much of a spoiler, she's had enough of the field, and so she says not everybody is cut out to be a field agent, and she takes her place behind the desk, and that's when we find out that her last name is Moneypenny. So that kind of, what would we call the division of labor in intelligence work, and this is actually how one former officer described it to me. Historically, at the CIA, the men would be doing the outdoor work and the women would be doing the indoor work. And so that was the mindset that really held sway for generations and generations at the agency, as they call it. So given this kind of background, I would invite you to take a look at this actual photograph of a debutante ball in Brussels, Belgium in 1966. The Central Intelligence Agency, which at this point is really the most powerful, most influential intelligence gathering and operation running agency in the world. It's a major arm of American intelligence and American diplomacy, is avidly recruiting one of the young people in this crowd at a debutante's ball in Belgium. And so if you look at this group, you think, well, who was being recruited for the CIA's covert operations branch? Maybe it's this guy, right? He looks the part. He's got a beautiful woman on his hand. He looks very confident and debonair. Or maybe it's this guy. He also looks the part. He's wearing the tuxedo, and he's sort of hanging back in the shadows, keeping an eye on the crowd. So any of those seem plausible candidates. But in fact, the person who was being recruited by the CIA in 1966 was this incredibly well-qualified young woman named Liza Mundy. And Lisa was the daughter of an American diplomat, Melvin Manful, very successful, influential member of the U.S. Foreign Service. She had grown up in France, in Paris. Her father was dispatched after the war, after World War II, to implement the Marshall Plan and to rebuild Europe. And so Lisa went to Paris at age 6. She spent 6 years in Paris. She was more fluent in French even than she was in English. By this time, having been to Brown University, she was also fluent in Spanish, in Mandarin Chinese, and several other languages. She had really grown up abroad, very comfortable on the streets of many foreign capitals at a time when not that many Americans were. And she also believed in America as, as the guardian of democracy around the world. She believed very much in the mission that her father had participated in at a time when some of her classmates at Brown were becoming disillusioned with government service, anticipating the war in Vietnam. It was becoming more controversial to be a public servant, and particularly the CIA was a controversial place to consider working. So Lisa, upon graduating from Brown, was being avidly but secretly recruited by the CIA's covert operations branch as well as its analysis branch. And I'll talk about this a little bit later about how the agency has two equally important main directorates there, and that was true at the time. And they both were courting Lisa, as was the U.S. State Department, where her father had worked, because she was seen as a very cosmopolitan, very presentable, a very committed American with an incredible background that qualified her for all kinds of work, including spy work. And Lisa, I think unusually for her classmates, she knew what spy work entailed. Her father had been posted to Vietnam, and she had spent some summers visiting her parents. As she said, you could always tell who the spooks were. And so she was very interested in this kind of work and believed rightfully that she would be very good at it. She was very comfortable working a crowd, very good social skills, which surprisingly spies very much need. So the reason that, even given its ideas about division of labor, the reason that the CIA was willing and eager to hire a woman as a covert operator really goes back to World War II, and in particular to Pearl Harbor, to the terrible surprise of Pearl Harbor, which was, as everyone knows, the event that launched the United States into World War II. It was also a great intelligence failure. It exposed the American public to the fact, hard as it is to believe these days, that we had no intelligence agencies to speak of. We had no ability to anticipate what other countries or what the enemy was about to do. For those of us who live in Washington, D.C., where we now have 18 intelligence agencies, we have intelligence agencies that exist to oversee other intelligence agencies. And it used to be 17 until recently, but the Space Force actually is our most recent addition to this pantheon. So we have a surfeit of intelligence agencies these days, but really on December 6th, 1941, we had none of this. We had no CIA, we had no NSA, we were really sort of blind to what was happening. We didn't have any code-breaking operation, and the country had to scale up its intelligence gathering at the very moment when tens and ultimately hundreds of thousands of young men were being sent into harm's way. So the young men were shipping out on convoys going across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. They were on aircraft carriers and destroyers in the Pacific. We had just now seen with Pearl Harbor what could happen to them, and the country had to do what we would today call scale up its intelligence gathering abilities really quickly, and it had to find people who could do that. So World War II was this terrible, terrifying, tragic moment, but it was also for women and for other citizens who had been relegated to the background of American life. It was a wonderful moment when, for the first time, women in particular, college-educated women, and women willing to go into factories and build delivery ships were not only recruited, but they were avidly competed for. So you can see here the Army's the Army was recruiting women, the Navy was recruiting women, women got recruited as code breakers, women got recruited as for their skills at reading blueprints, for designing computers. Grace Hopper, who many people have heard of these days, was instrumental in developing the Navy's first computers. So not just factories, but also brain work. There was intense competition. And so when the government realized that we had to create not only a code-breaking operation, but a spy service, there was the realization that women could be useful to the creation of such a service. When Wild Bill Donovan was drafted, he was a former war hero in World War I. He was now a bored Wall Street lawyer. He was tapped by President Roosevelt to create a spy service. He went to England, which had been doing this for quite some time, and and a story is that he emerged from a meeting with the British spy service, and he'd written the word women on a legal pad and circled it, because the British had already learned that women from some of their fine universities could be very useful money pennies, basically. Very, very useful, sort of unseen, underappreciated, but vital contributors to the intelligence operation that the British had quite ably developed by that point. So the OSS, the Office for Strategic Services, was the forerunner of the CIA, created to give us the ability to gather information overseas. And the OSS becomes one more competitor for well-educated, adventurous women who could help us build our intelligence gathering abilities really basically overnight. And so when I was doing my research for the Sisterhood, I came upon this remarkable document called The Assessment of Men. And another really interesting and watershed moment that World War II represents is it was a time when a lot of our personality testing, our aptitude testing for the workplace was developed, because all of a sudden, all of these people were being hired for jobs that had no longer existed, had not existed before that, or people were being brought into the workplace like women who didn't necessarily have resumes, who didn't necessarily have work experience, and so they had to develop an ability to evaluate somebody. And this was true in a unique way for a spy service, a fledgling spy service. You have to figure out who has an aptitude for a job like this? What sort of person could be sent overseas, could be resourceful, could work, say, with the French resistance, could work with allies in China, could live in a foreign country at a time when very few Americans had even traveled abroad, could, operate resourcefully when things started to go wrong, as they inevitably would? How do you tell who has the ability to live a covert life, to develop an identity, a completely new identity, and to stick to that story in maybe an occupied Norway, to cross-country ski with the members of the Norwegian resistance? I mean, these were jobs that had never existed before, and all of a sudden they were trying to secretly find people who could do them. So they had to develop a way to assess people's personality as it might unfold in a situation. So a bank of psychologists was engaged to develop a test, and it's what we today would call role-playing. So groups of men who were sort of secretly contacted while Bill Donovan came from a very affluent family. He mingled with lawyers and wealthy Americans. The description of sort of early spies for the OSS, and this would hold true for the CIA as well, was pale, male, and Yale. So he liked people who came from affluent, well-educated backgrounds, and would so send out feelers to men. So men were recruited as well, and they would be given a role-playing test where they would be taken to an off-site facility in the Northern Virginia countryside, Leesburg or somewhere like that. They would be invited to stay there for 3 days. They had to develop a new identity, couldn't tell anybody who they really were. They had to stick to their cover story. They were observed even during meals and at night, when they were drinking. And it didn't necessarily count against you if you drank a lot, but you had to be able to keep your cover story. Even, they wanted to see who could hold their liquor. And so there would be these role-playing operations in which groups of men would be put, say, by a babbling brook and said, okay, imagine this is a rushing river. You're at a chasm in Norway. You've got a machine gun. You've got to cross the river. The bridge has been blown out. You're being pursued. How are you going to get there? And so they would be observed to see who could see that there was some 2x4s lying by the side of the stream, who could persuade their colleagues to build a bridge, who could sort of herd everybody together and exhibit the sort of leadership qualities on the fly that people would need in the theater of war. And so it was a 3-day experiment to see how personalities would unfold. Who did people trust? Who was sort of pessimistic about their ability to get the job done? Who could put up with frustrations? And sometimes they would plan plant shirkers and naysayers in the group to frustrate the leader that would emerge, because they had to see how you could cope with frustration and and setbacks, which were inevitable in this kind of operation in the field of war. So that was the way that the men were assessed. But they also needed and recruited women, and they got some really extraordinary female recruits. The women who applied to work for the OSS were college educated at a time when only 4% of American women had the benefit of a college degree, because so many colleges were closed to women at the time. But more than half of the female recruits had a college education. Many of them had master's degrees. Many of them spoke foreign languages. Many of them were employed and had a salary that was commensurate to the average male salary at a time when that was very unusual, particularly, for women. So it was a very well-qualified group of women, and they were brought into a, not taken out into the field, not stationed before a brook, but they were brought into a room at a brownstone in Washington, D.C., and they were given 10 letters and index cards, and they were told to devise a good cross-reference filing system for these memos so that they could be stored and retrieved. And so basically it was secretarial clerks' work that they were being assessed for their ability to develop a good cross-reference system. Now, don't get me wrong. As a person who has to manage a lot of information, I have full respect for anybody who's good at filing things and retrieving them easily. It's very important work in this day and time, and it was very important for the OSS and ultimately the CIA. You've got all these people gathering information now around the world, but they've got to get it back to headquarters, and they've got to keep track of it so that the information can be procured when somebody needs it. So this was important work, but it was low-level secretarial work that these women who might have done that work at some time in their life thought they were beyond, thought they had gone beyond that. So they too were being observed not only for their ability to work together, not only for their ability to file papers, but for their ability to put up with the frustrations, the peculiar frustration of being overlooked and underestimated and given work that was beneath them. And the reason they were being assessed for the ability to put up with this, what Elizabeth Warren would today call, persisting, was because there were women on that panel of psychologists, and they knew that that was what was going to happen to them in this organization, at least at the beginning. And so they needed to have the sort of resilience and stick-to-itiveness that would enable them to rise above this unique frustration. And just to give you an example of a few of the women who, this actually, what you see is there's a lot of paperwork in war. This was the map-making unit of the OSS, so you can see and this was true of the code breakers as well, there really was a lot of paperwork, and a lot of it really was on 3x5 file cards. So again, not to minimize the importance of that task, but you can see who got stuck with it and who was out in the field, at least at first, doing the exciting stuff. So the money penny James Bond dichotomy existed from the get-go. This OSS officer, Julia McWilliams, is one of my favorites. She was a graduate of Smith College. She came from a very well-connected family in California. She wanted to join the Women's Army Corps during the war and do her part, but she was too tall, so she didn't meet the Army service requirements. But she, as I said, came from a well-connected family, so William Donovan got wind of her, and she started out as his clerk. But she would ultimately, a lot of the women's careers did get accelerated during the war, and so she would end up traveling to China, where she apparently did not get airsick very easily, and she withstood some really terrifying plane rides in China and worked in the analysis unit in China. She also met a State Department officer named Paul Child, who was a map maker for the State Department. And then after the war, after her service, there was this nationwide effort to sort of stuff the genie back in the bottle to return to the nation's regularly scheduled programming in which women weren't part of these sorts of efforts. And so the women were encouraged to stop what they did and to get married and have start the baby boom. And so Julia McWilliams left the service after the war. She did marry the State Department map maker, and she traveled with him as part of his career to France. where she famously had the best meal that she had ever had in her life. She had an epiphany. She decided to learn how to cook on the level of the French. She then wrote a cookbook called Mastering the Art of French Cooking. Her editors thought it would go nowhere because it had a gerund in the title, Mastering, and so they weren't optimistic for the success of her cookbook, but she became known to the world as Julia Child. And so the many gifts that World War II gave us, freedom, democracy, things like that. Our food also tastes a lot better than it would have if Joey McWilliams had been accepted into the WACs, right? Everything, including our cuisine, could have been completely different. Just a couple of the other women who served the intelligence effort during the war, American women. This is Cora Dubois. She was an anthropologist who was the first woman to head up a whole analytic unit in Southeast Asia. She had been an expert on one island before the war, and that was enough. We were so ignorant about so much of the world. That was enough to make her head of this whole analysis unit in Southeast Asia, where she did a wonderful job. She was also an open lesbian, which was unusual at the time, but was not a barrier to entry at that time. And this is the entertainer Josephine Baker, who was a well-known performer in France. And I love this photo of her in particular because you often see a photo of her in her dance garb, often wearing very little in the way of clothing, but she was a businesswoman also. And during the war, she was an intelligence operative. And among the things that she did was smuggle secret messages out of France into Africa as the invasion of Italy was being planned, and it was smuggled in invisible ink on her sheet music. And she performed many other intelligence contributions during the war. And I always end up talking too long about World War II, but the reason that it is so salient and so important, obviously, for many reasons, but so relevant to the modern day is because it was a moment of what we today would call inclusion. We talk today of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's become quite a controversial term, but it is important to remember that World War II was a moment when the Allies made the decision to be inclusive. The United States, England, the other Allied nations brought in women. In this country, we had the Tuskegee Airmen proving that black men could fly planes. We had the Native American code talkers in the Pacific, very brave Marines who were using their native Navajo language to communicate and to protect our communications. So it wasn't a perfect moment of inclusion. We interned our Japanese American citizens. We had a segregated army, but it was far more inclusive than the country had ever been before that time. And it was a real difference between the Allies and the Axis nations. Germany, by definition, was attempting to exterminate portions of its population, Jewish citizens, gay and lesbian citizens, deaf people, and the Japanese also did not bring women into their war effort on anything like this level. So whenever, if you feel you want to make the argument for DEI or feel that you need to, it's important to look back at this moment and at a moment when the decision was made to tap the talents of all of our citizens, our full citizenry, and that is one of the factors that made the difference in whether the good guys won the war. So I just hope that this point was made to me by a male historian when I was researching Code Girls, and I've really never forgotten it as something that I think does not get sufficiently appreciated or discussed. But as I said, after the war, the effort was made to kind of put that genie back in the bottle, return to our regularly scheduled programming. It was also briefly thought that we would roll up our intelligence gathering efforts and that we wouldn't need any more spy service, we wouldn't need any more code breaking. But of course, World War II gives way to the Cold War and our existential contest with the Soviet Union and with communism around the world, efforts to stem the rise of communism and to combat the Soviet Union, the sort of spy versus spy contest that would go on for decades and would really define the world in which we lived in. for much of the 20th century. And so the OSS gave way to the CIA, which at first was so clandestine and so covert that it had an office in downtown Washington. It's still there, but it had a sign outside that said the Bureau of Naval Medicine. So its existence was sort of, or at least the location of its headquarters was not publicly acknowledged for quite some time. But ultimately, the American public becomes aware that we have now something called the Central Intelligence Agency. This was the really most famous early director, and like so many of the directors and the top officers at the CIA, Allen Dulles, his brother John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State, and they also had a sister, Eleanor Dulles, who was a high-level officer in the federal government, although she had to sort of move around depending on where her brothers were to avoid nepotism. So she was the sibling who had to sort of adjust depending on where the two men were heading up operations. So Allen Dulles was the sort of, he was viewed as sort of a schoolmaster, a tweedy, cerebral guy, but he was really the person who was in control of a lot of the anti-communist operations, including many of the controversial operations that ultimately came to light to determine the outcome of elections in foreign countries, to, if need be, depose foreign leaders, to try to, famously invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. That was a disastrous Bay of Pigs operation. But for several decades, the CIA was allowed to sort of do what it did unimpeded, and Allen Dulles, to the extent that there was a face of the CIA, was the face of the CIA. But the fact was that that the CIA still needed women, right? I'll talk a little bit about the organization of the CIA and the most desirable jobs. The most desirable job at the CIA was the James Bond job that had the very bland term of case officer. And these were the fighter pilots of the CIA. These were the men, and they were inevitably men, who were sent out around the world to live a covert existence, and it was their job to help us avoid another Pearl Harbor, to gather the information from occupants of foreign countries that countries were trying to hide from the United States, to get that information back to the United States so that the president could be informed, so that we would never again have a terrible surprise or, God forbid, a nuclear attack. And so that was a very desirable job. And if you succeeded at a case officer, then you might become a station chief. So you would be in charge of, all of England. You would be the London bureau chief, or you would be the Berlin bureau chief, or you would be the Hong Kong bureau chief. You were called a station chief. And then if you were really successful, you would become a division chief, and you would be in charge of a whole section of the world. And that was a great job. And so it was generally, at first, a network of men who had served in the OSS, including Allen Dulles, who sort of got together to decide who would get what kind of job. So it was a very closed network of white men. No more gays and lesbians could serve in American intelligence for decades and decades. So there was a real closing of that door. And certainly it was still very helpful to be pale male in Yale in this environment. So it was not an easy environment for men as well, and it was very competitive. But there were women who stayed on, and they were put in this money penny kind of role, and they were often put in this job of filing the information that was gathered so as to make it available to the agency when it needed it. And again, we underestimate, or maybe just don't think about, how important it is to keep these records. So the women who were in charge of what was called the vaults, literal 3x5 cards, were denigrated as vault women. They were called the tennis shoe ladies or the vault women, but they knew those stacks backward and forward. They knew who the KGB officers were. They knew where all the bodies were buried. They had this, they were like the brain of the CIA, so that this sort of information could be used when it needed to be used. And so the women realized that they weren't getting the promotions that the men were getting, and they began to agitate and ask why. So this study was done, a panel was formed. It was literally called the Petticoat Panel. That was how seriously it was taken, and I'm joking there. And you can see that because the CIA was shocked to learn, that women weren't getting promoted to these top jobs of division chief or whatever. And so Allen Dulles reluctantly agreed, probably prodded by his sister Eleanor, to conduct a study to see why women weren't getting promoted, those who had stayed on after the war. And this study was then kept under wraps so that nobody was classified, which the agency, historically has relied upon when it doesn't want information to get out. So you can see this was done in 1953, and it didn't get declassified until 2013, the findings of it. But reading through it now, the sorts of stereotypical presentations of women and their capabilities would be echoed down the generation as women increasingly began to file EEOC complaints, discrimination lawsuits, class action lawsuits. Depositions would be taken, and the powers that were at the agency would opine on what women were capable of and what women weren't capable of to justify the state of affairs, which was basically, extreme pigeonholing and discrimination of the women officers at the agency. So I'll just treat you quickly to a few of these proclamations. The idea was that women can't run agents. Now, in intelligence gathering, agent has a specific meaning. It means your asset in the foreign country, the person in the foreign country who is risking their life to give you information. That is called an agent or an asset. And the belief was that women didn't have the chutzpah to be able to talk somebody into giving up this information. It's the same idea that held true on Wall Street or in law firms, that women weren't the rainmakers, women weren't the deal makers. They couldn't make the ask to ask somebody to commit treason and spy for their country. So just to give you a sense of the kinds of guys who were out there doing it, the man in the Speedo, David Whipple, was a graduate of the OSS, played football at Dartmouth. He was a station chief all over the world. This is one of my favorite photos. This one didn't end up in the book because the person who shared it just couldn't bring herself to sign the release. But anyway, these were the kinds of people who were having, let me say, a great time out there in the world collecting information. They had lots of money. They had lots of power. Being a station chief or a division chief was a very powerful position at a time when America was the power all over the world. So these were great jobs, and they basically just didn't want to give them up. So the women had to fight against, going back to the assessment of men, the women had to fight against all these barriers. So I wanted to talk about this particular Richmond native. Eloise Randolph Page was an FFV 2 times over. She was a Randolph and a Page. And she started working for Wild Bill Donovan during World War II. She had a great temperament and personality for being a spy because she learned all the men's deepest, darkest secrets, including Donovan's. And they had a lot of secrets. And there was a lot of what was called at the time womanizing that went on with women, not their wives. And Eleanor Page had no compunction about using this intelligence that she gathered on her colleagues. And so she was the first woman to rise up to be a GS-18. She was much feared at the CIA. They would not give her a case officer job. She was given administrative, moneypenny type of jobs, but she still used her wits and her smart to rise up to a position where she was in charge of all the covert action budgets. So she was in charge of the money. So the station chiefs had to come to her to beg for money to run their operations, and they hated it, and they didn't like working for her. And so this is one of my favorite anecdotes in the book, and just sort of a long story short. They made her, in order to get rid of her in her financial, powerful role, they made her the first female station chief in the CIA just to get her out of the headquarters at Langley. The CIA by then had moved to Northern Virginia, and because they thought she would fail. They thought that they sent her to Athens, where her immediate predecessor had been assassinated. And they thought she would never be able to hold her own with the Greeks. This is a macho culture. She, was she was a white glove wearing little old, at that point, older Virginian. She was in her 60s, and she was sent to training for the first time. And they thought that she would just fall on her face. And instead, she had gone to Holland's. She had all of these social skills. She was incredibly well equipped to charm the Greeks, and they loved her. She was highly successful. She was so successful as a station chief that they then wanted to yank her back. And so they ran this is the kind of institution that the CIA is. They ran an operation against her where they brought her back to headquarters to be on a panel. They sent an emissary there to collect dirt on her from the officers who had to work for her. Some of them didn't like working for women, so they gave up some dirt on her. Others didn't, they steered clear. She was well-wired enough that she found out about what was going on. She came back to Athens. She divided them up into two rooms. She said, you, and you all ratted on me. You all didn't. You guys are out. And so that is the sort of skill set that, this person hired as a secretary clerk had to have in order to survive in this really knives-out environment. But Eloise Page was not a member of the Sisterhood in the sense that she did not have any female colleagues to help her along the way, and she was not known for helping younger women along the way because she had to work so hard to rise to the position that she got. So in the book, you'll meet a couple of women who came along in the next generation. And so one of them was Heidi August, recruited, college graduate, political science major, recruited in 1968. All of her male colleagues were offered positions as case officers. Heidi was hired as a clerk secretary, and she spent 10 years making coffee, filing classified files, and ultimately helping to evacuate the CIA station in Cambodia when the Khmer Rouge was closing in, and proving that women can certainly work under the pressures of urgency. And after 10 years, Heidi August was able to work her way into a case officer position in which she proved, to the great surprise of the CIA, they used to think that another reason not to have women as case officers was because they would try to get information from other women in foreign countries, and women didn't know anything, right? So why would you want that? But Heidi was sent to the UN in Geneva on her first assignment. You'll see that Shirley Temple Black in the foreground. So Heidi's day job, because she's working clandestinely, is to squire around people coming to the UN. She's theoretically working for the State Department. But at night, she's a covert operative gathering information. And what she realizes is that the UN is full of disgruntled clerks and secretaries, women who have access to every classified document in their office, be they European, be they Russian, be they South African. And so in another one of my favorite operations, Heidi very successfully targets another woman and gets, due to this woman's disgruntlement, gets a piece of information that the CIA had been trying to get for years, if not decades. So she's the sort of person, again, who's able to rise over these barriers. Meanwhile, Lisa Manful is put in case officer training. You see her here at the center of her class at the farm. Yeah, that's Lisa. You saw her in her debutante's outfit. Now she's in her paramilitary gear at this famous place called the Farm, where CIA young officers are trained after the war. You see her now in her disguise class. But what happens, what the CIA tries to do to Lisa, even though they've let her into the clandestine service, is they try to make her what's called a reports officer. And that, again, is the money penny job, where she's undercover, but she's basically the secretary in a foreign station whose job it is to receive the reports from the case officers, whatever vital information they've collected, and then send it back to headquarters. So she's like the go-between, but she's not out in the streets. She's not using her social skills to meet people at diplomatic parties and wheedle information out of them. So Lisa fought back against the system, and she said, no. Being a reports officer is important, but that's not what I'm going to be best at. You said I could be a case officer. I want to be a case officer, and I'm sticking to it. So they yanked her out of training. They sent her back to headquarters while she was sort of drifting around trying to figure out her next step because there was no sisterhood or network to help her, she married a colleague, a fellow case officer, which is really common, particularly in an intelligence setting where you want a spouse, if you have a spouse, who is sort of understands what you do. The expectation at the time for women was that if you get married, you're out. No overseas career for you. And so Lisa was made to resign completely as a CIA officer because she was now a wife. And this was true at the U.S. State Department as well. Your career was over if you got married. So the sacrifice that so many women made after the war to do this work was to forego marriage and to forego children. And so Lisa was now a wife, but she was sent overseas with her husband, expected to help him, unpaid. Her career is over, operating on what was called housewife cover. So really, if you're a spy, what you want is for nobody to suspect you. You don't want to be James Bond. You don't want to be flashy, wearing tuxedos in casinos. You want everybody to think you're an unimportant housewife as you're carrying around a grocery bag or something full of top secret intelligence papers. So it emerged quickly that Lisa was better at this than her husband. She followed him around for 10 years until, not surprisingly, the marriage failed. And then she was able to rebuild her career at the CIA. And she was so good and so successful that she ultimately became the first female division chief, not just a station chief, but the first female division chief at the CIA. They were called barons, and Lisa became the first baroness. But that gives you, again, an idea of the discrimination and the assumptions that women had to overcome. Just one other wife to introduce you to, disproving the notion that women won't travel. Shirley Sulik was the wife of a Moscow officer named Mike Sulik, and she was a very enthusiastic, very, very effective asset to his career. She died while I was doing my research, and I wasn't able to interview her, but I interviewed Mike, her husband, who was very, very glad of the opportunity to sing her praises as a wife and her contribution, because again, particularly in Moscow, when suspected CIA officers are under so much pressure, under so much surveillance from the KGB, the wife was the one who could sneak around the corner and pick up the classified papers. Shirley was very adept. You see that big bag she's carrying. She would like dump out some pens or a lipstick and sweep up the documents that they needed. So she was a full partner to his career. So women for generations were full partners often in their husbands' careers, and they often got no credit at all, as well as no benefits from their service. So, women are more emotional, less objective. They are not sufficiently aggressive. Jean Vertifoy, hired in 1968, fluent in Mandarin Chinese, told that her college degree didn't matter. All the CIA cared about was whether she could type. So she went to secretarial school and learned how to type, and got sent around the world to do menial tasks, worked her way up, and it was Jean Vertifoy and a team of women who unmasked the traitor Aldrich Ames, who had been passing the identity of Soviet assets back to the KGB, resulting in the deaths of assets that people like Mike Sulik had so assiduously cultivated. And this team of women were friends with Aldrich Ames and his second wife, Rosario. They went, among other sleuthing, this was the Miss Marple of Russia House. When they were looking for who might be the mole, the CIA mole, the women of this team went to their house, and they noticed that in their house in North Arlington, Virginia, they had just remodeled it. They had fancy cars in the driveway, and they had new curtains, new window treatments at every window in this very large house. And the women of the team knew that on a public servant salary, you couldn't afford to renovate your house that sort of, massively. You would normally get like new window treatments for each room kind of once a year, So they saw the sort of renovations that were being done, and they also did an incredible amount of financial work looking at his bank accounts, at his deposits, to finally unmask Aldrich Ames, really the most notorious traitor that came from within the ranks of the CIA, and a legacy beneficiary of the Old Boys Network at the CIA. So this is the sort of work that the women had to do. Meanwhile, just to talk quickly about a group of analysts, you might say to yourself, well, this is what Richard Helms said, just to summarize. He was a CIA director in the early 1970s. Okay, this was during the middle of an EEOC complaint. Okay, so the women aren't being used to the best of their abilities. You know, what's going to happen? Is the government going to just shut down because we're not using them to the fullest? So after the fall of the Soviet Union, the triumph of democracy, a team of the CIA was sort of adrift, but there was a team of analysts at the CIA, largely women, who had been paying attention to a new threat that was rising as communism was declining as a threat. And that new threat was terrorism. They were taking a look at independent actors who were communicating with each other around the world. They were a shadowy network. They were being funded by some guy named Osama Bin Laden. They called themselves Al-Qaeda. They didn't have a country that was backing them. They didn't have an army. They didn't have uniforms. They didn't, even know their name at first. And this group, led by a woman named Gina Bennett, were warning and warning and warning for years that this threat needed to be taken seriously. They weren't known as well as Hamas or Hezbollah, and it took them a long time within the building to make their voices be heard in this really hyper-competitive, elitist environment that the CIA was and is. They had to basically beat at people's doors to get them to take this threat seriously, and then to try to convince the incoming Bush administration to take this threat seriously. So the result of their voices not being listened to, even as they were using their brains to the maximum, was the tragedy of September 1st, 2001, September 11th, 2001, when the World Trade Center was attacked and the Pentagon as well. So it was the second Pearl Harbor that our country has experienced in American history, and it was, if not the direct result, certainly one factor in this was ignoring the largely female team that had been warning about this possibility at that point for years, if not for a full decade. To the credit of the institution, they began taking much more seriously the skill set that those women had developed, and it was a new kind of skill set called targeting, it goes back to the days of the Vault women. It's knowing the biographies and identities and locations of bad actors around the world, understanding their communications with each other and how to find them and how to target them. So that skill set became much more valued during the hunt for bin Laden. And so it was a strikingly female team who managed to go back and back and back through the data sets the CIA collected for a decade as the hunt was on for bin Laden. This was from a video footage of the Jeep that the courier was using to communicate with bin Laden, who was holed up at a compound in Abbottabad. And they didn't have any DNA or forensic or conclusive evidence that it was bin Laden who was there, but they were able to reach him through his courier, and it was this group of female targeters going back to the days of the Vault women who had the skill set to find him and to think of the relationships, the people around him who would be using technology like cell phones to communicate with him, because he wasn't online and he wasn't using cell phones. And when they were looking at the compound and trying to assess whether that was really bin Laden there, one of the things that they looked at was the laundry on the line, to try and understand if there were families in the compound as well, so that when the Navy SEALs went in to that compound, they could avoid the families, the wives, the children, and try to concentrate on the one target. And a Navy SEAL after the operation said that it was remarkable how accurate that intelligence was. So again, window curtains, laundry on the line, not saying men don't do laundry, but again, it's an argument for diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? People from all sorts of backgrounds who can look at aerial surveillance technology and look at it for different factors. So one last look at Lisa Harper, who came out of retirement. Oh, let's just go through Richard Helms there and put him to bed. Lisa Lisa actually came out of retirement to join the hunt for bin Laden. She was a very important element of that hunt with her skill set all over the world. It was very satisfying when this book was published. This was really a coming out for Lisa, who had never talked about her covert operations and was sort of nervous about it. And it was exciting to see her get the credit that she deserved. But just to make the final case for why history matters. And this is right, this is old information. We've seen Mad Men. We know that women were treated this way in the workplace. Many of us in this room know what had to be overcome to achieve your position in your own workplace. But the literal end result of all of this history and all of the work sort of speaks for itself, really. So with that, I'll be glad to take some questions. Yeah, and they have, I'm told there are microphones that are going to come around. I don't, let's see.
Or show me a hand, show me a hand.
Oh, yeah. Sorry to make you walk all the way across the aisle.
No. Thank you for talking today. My name is Christine Hansen. I was recruited by the CIA in the early 90s, specifically because I spoke 7 languages. I was seriously in publishing. I worked for National Public Radio. And when I asked the guy on the phone, I said, well, why me? He said, because there are all these 22-year-old guys who think they're going to be James Bond. He said, we don't need James Bonds. We need people who are actually educated and intelligent.
I'm happy to know that somebody recognized that.
Well, I didn't go ahead because my English husband refused to go to spy camp, as well he should. I know a lot about British spies and code-breaking and everything, but I have to admit I didn't really know anything about this. Are your books the first to come out on this topic? And thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you for your comments, and that's a great anecdote. I'm glad. Yeah, and I think people still do go into the agency thinking they're going to be James Bond. The Code Girls was the first book about American women code breakers. It certainly was, and the women of Bletchley Park, I think, have gotten more publicity. The women code breakers of England, even though our code breaking force was larger than that of England's, and more than half of our code breaking force was women. I think that the British have done a better job with the glamour of and because there exists a Bletchley Park that you can visit and you can actually see like the cigar stains on the ceiling and you can get your hair done like in the 1940s. Like the British have been better at keeping that alive, the wonderful story of the successes. And I think not to get too granular, but our code breaking was split between the Army and the Navy at the time. It's now the NSA is now the agency that carries forth that work. And I think if we had a single facility that did give full justice, a museum of sorts that gave full justice to our code-breaking operation, then there would be more awareness of that. There is a great spy museum in Washington, D.C. I highly recommend a visit, and the women's story is certainly told there. But by and large, I don't think as a country that we've been as good at publishing this part of the story.
Thank you again. Can you hear me?
Oh, good.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, hi.
Hi. I was wondering about re-entry. You've changed your name, and you've lived a life outside of your family and your community. Did they have to have a lot of therapy to re-enter?
So you're saying presumably like after their clandestine career is over,
Yeah.
and they're re-entering normal life, and I think it is very difficult to get used to that. But you know, it's interesting. It used to be that if you had worked in the clandestine service, you really would maybe never talk about it, and your children wouldn't necessarily even know what their parent did. And this was traumatic for the kids as well. And so William Colby, a very well-known director of the CIA, one of his sons said, you know, once we found out about, we worried were we just like props for our dad, you know, to make him look like just an ordinary father abroad. He would bring us into meetings like where we just, you know, sort of there to like normalize him so that he wouldn't be suspected. So it's hard on the families and hard on the children. But one of the things that I think is increasingly true is, well, like Abigail Spanberger, people these days don't necessarily make a full 30-year career out of it. And so they do go into, in her case, public life, public service, a different form of public service. But also, if you've served there for 10 years or so, I interviewed women who then would then go on LinkedIn and to you know, get their next job working for Palantir or one of these big tech companies that also was very involved in the search for Bin Laden. And you know, you have these skills that are incredibly sought after, particularly in these days of data management, right? Getting back to those file cards and learning data retrieval systems. So I think the CIA has become more savvy and flexible about letting people talk about their careers and acknowledge that they did have a career in covert operations. They're not doing it now. They can't talk about, you know, most of what they did. But there is a recognition that there is a life after this service. You're not necessarily tied to it for your whole career. And again, I think we see in Abigail Spanberger and other women in Congress now with national security backgrounds how important, you know, how much gravitas and knowledge it does impart to then a second career in public service. I think that the agency's probably better now with things like therapy, and because it is still a very strenuous job being posted in these remote overseas locations where sometimes you can't even, sometimes it's so dangerous you can't even leave the compound. But I am told that sometimes there's still a stigma against seeking, say, counseling because you don't want ever to be not considered for an exciting operation. So one of the younger women that I interviewed said that she still was kind of reluctant to seek any kind of, you know, counseling, online counseling, because she just never wanted to be excluded from an operation. So it's still psychologically, I think, very hard. Thanks for having me.